Mr. Troy Ford, welcome to Writers in Relationship.
Thank you, Gail. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so happy to see you. And I always start with one of my favorite things, which is origin stories. So, do
Oh,
you want to talk about how we know each other? What's the origin of our connection? And I'm curious because I was trying to remember it last night, and
oh, you don't remember?
I was in the car with there, and I'm like, I know it's on LinkedIn, but I didn't know exactly how it came. But anyway, you tell it from your point of view.
I don't actually remember what the link was, what the post was what the was, on LinkedIn, but it was LinkedIn of all places. And uh, in fact, it was at a time I actually have thought about this and honestly believe that this sort of momentary interlude of about 2 weeks when I was like, yeah, I'm going to get more active on LinkedIn was actually meant for me to meet you there because you're like the only person that came out of that little 2 week window. You know what I mean? Ever since I've just been like, done. I found Gail. I'm done with LinkedIn. So that's all I remember.
And then, like, how did it evolve after that?
And then let's see. I don't know. I think you must have subscribed to Ford Knows Books and QStack. It might have been around the same time. I can't remember. And then I encouraged you to start your own Substack, and Writers in Relationship came out of that. And then we did Unsung together, the short film with Kim Warner, and that was great fun and a really big project, and we won an award, and it was really so incredibly rewarding. So yeah, we've been having fun.
Yeah, it was totally great. Yeah, and you published on QStack, I think my novel excerpt, I think
Oh, that was
was that the very first thing you published on QStack?
yes, it was. It was. Your novel
Such an
excerpt
honor.
was the very first QStack post. Oh my God, good memory. Wow, yeah, that's so funny.
Well, it was meaningful. I mean, it really was like it I felt very supported and honored and like, wow, he wants to publish my writing.
I totally did. I totally did. Yeah. And that was for Falling Through the Night, right?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so since then we've each had our first novels come out, and now
Mhm.
your second novel's coming out, and that was one of the
Yeah.
reasons I wanted to have you back. But tell us before we get into any of that, I'm curious about your evolution as a writer, and just tell us a little bit about that and when you started writing and when you got serious about it, and just some of the story behind that.
So I think you've probably heard this before that that I wanted to write since I was a kid, and that I read Harriet the Spy, and I was just like, that's it. That is the life for me. I think at the time it was almost as much about the spy as it was about the the writer. But so yeah, in fact, I can still remember actually. So we were living in Saudi Arabia at the time. So we were living overseas, and so we lived on a compound, and obviously there were no, I don't know if you remember Harriet Spy, but the dumb waiter, and all uh, the circuitous route she took to spy on all these people or whatever, but we didn't have all of that, of course. So I remember me and my friend both just like he had all these big like shrubs in the front of his house, and they were quite big, and they had little spaces in between them where it was like you could hide, and so we actually hid in the bushes. And had our notebooks out, and we're just like, as people walked by, we would be like, who was it? What were they, what were they wearing? Or if they were talking, even better, this is what they were talking about. You know what I mean? And it was just so ridiculous. But God, I wish I had that journal still. I tell you
Was that
what.
one of the earliest memories you have of actually writing when you were a kid?
Absolutely. Yeah, that
So
is the first memory I have of writing, of of my little journal and hiding in the bushes and spying on people as they walk past.
Like you see the progression, right? Like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
where I am, I'll be.
the complete crazy. For sure. So anyway, so that was that, and I was really into it. And then we had a creative writing class, I think, in like junior high school, and our teacher, she made us pick pen names, and so my pen name was Xavier Gadfly, and um, I got there was this writer back in the 70s, 80s or whatever, especially in Europe, and her name was Xaviera Supersex. And I got my hands on. I probably didn't buy it, and it wasn't my parents. I think it was at a on a vacation in Greece, I think, and I went to the hotel gift shop and you know there was this this spicy racy book that I was like, oh, what's that? And it was her name was Xavier Supersex, and she was a columnist who had written a book. And I was like, Xavier, oh, what an exotic name. So I adopted Xavier, and then Gadfly, I think it was I think a teacher kind of used that word, and I was just like, what does that mean? And I looked it up. I like read the dictionary for a while, like actually read the dictionary. That's what I came up with. So that was sort of the interim creative writing, junior high. When we came back to the States, then I took another creative writing course, and I really wanted to do it like all through high school. Didn't have as many opportunities to write creatively in high school, and then the fateful day. I think we've talked about this before when I went to a summer school and took a creative writing course, and the teachers just ripped me a new one. Were just like humiliated me in front of the entire class, and I just seized up for the next 30 years, you know. So it made me so self-conscious and so afraid of incurring that kind of really abusive feedback ever again, that I couldn't finish a novel for anything. I started dozens of them and would get 30, sometimes 50 pages into it, and then I would just start to I would just it was almost like the color would just all drain out of the story, as it became something I could really be excited about. And it was like my mind or my unconscious was just saying, letting the blood drain out of the story. So I wouldn't get to the point where I actually would share it with people. So that went on for a long, 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 long time. And I got on with it. And, I worked in financial services and I worked in interior design. And then we moved to Spain, and lockdown happened in 2020, March 10th, I think it was. And it was a total lockdown here in Spain. Like you couldn't leave the house for 3 months. And so, I mean, we could go to the grocery store, we could walk the dog, and if you had a doctor's appointment, that was it. So I had nothing to do. I didn't have a job. I had intended to write to teach English, and I got my certificate when we first arrived, the May before that. And but the job that I had gotten after I got my certificate had kind of evaporated with the lockdown, and so I had nothing to do, and um, I just decided this is it. I'm gonna give it one more try. And this time, what was different was, rather than trying to write fantasy, which was always what I absolutely loved, fantasy, and wanted to be I wanted to be like J.R.R. Tolkien. I wanted to be like, John Crowley, the author of one of my absolute favorite fantasy books, Little Big. I wanted to be like them, but this time I decided I was going to write something, like realistic, personal, and just, draw somewhat from my own life, but also just kind of make things up, but not try and make it, this big, high fantasy, good versus evil thing, and just make it things that I knew about, right? What you know, as they say. And I was able, over the next 6 months to actually finish a novel. And that's Waterspout. That's the book we're here to talk about today. Here's the cover.
Oh, it's so nice. Wait, so you wrote Waterspout before you wrote Lamb?
I did. I did.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But you
And
pub
I
but you published Lamb first. I'm curious about that.
Well, with Waterspout, I didn't know about Substack. I didn't know about serializing. I didn't know about anything really. You know what I mean? All I knew was, oh, okay. I knew enough that you have to get an agent. So I did the research and I got Query Tracker and I sent my query letter to 60 different agents. I got some full requests, but ultimately I didn't get a yes. And so I kind of put it to the side at the same time as I was reading all about, making a start as a writer. You need a platform, and a newsletter was a good way to do that, right? So, in a roundabout way, I ended up with Substack. Beginning of 2023, I started Ford Knows Books, and about 10 months in or so, I mean, I was reading other authors on Substack who were serializing novels. So Ben Wakeman was the first one I really became aware of. There was he put out a note. No, was it even a note? I can't remember now, but if Notes was even live on Substack yet in 2023. I think it was maybe it was just getting started. But anyway, he put out a notice, let's just say, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I'm going to give, 100 people, access to my serialized novel. And I'd love if you were one of them or whatever. And it was The Memory of My Shadow, a great cyber AI um, sort of horror thriller novel, and it was just wonderful. And Ben has become a great friend as well. And I was also reading Eleanor Anstruther was serializing In Judgment of Others. I started reading Kim Warner's memoir as a serial, Unfixed. And so I waited 10 months after I started my Substack and started at that point just writing a new one. I was ready to start writing a second novel after I had finished, Waterspout already. So ready to start writing a second novel. And I thought, well, I did want to try and give independent publishing a try rather than going the traditional route. And I also knew that, or at least I thought that, uh, by publishing it as a serial first, that it would be kind of become radioactive to agents and publishers, and so I just decided that when I started writing it, even that I was going to, independently publish, self-publish that particular one. And the response I got was so wonderful. And not in terms of like, huge numbers, viral and anything like that, but just the people. And remember, at this point, I was still just coming out of my shell of that horrible early experience and writer's block and just, really feeling so unsure of myself and so afraid of, what the feedback might be from people that getting that, from a lot of them and many others, too many others to name, the support and how wonderful it was for them to just be like, I love this. I love this character. So many people say, I have fallen in love with Lamb. He is such just, like such a great, goofy, wonderful giant of a character. You know what I mean? And so I was just completely, it just filled me up. You know what I mean? It just filled me up. It gave me back that spark and that hope and that ambition to publish. And so that's why Lamb became my first book. And now going back, you know what I mean? I was like, I've written the follow-up substantially. I've written the follow-up to Lamb. So there's going to be a second and there's going to be a third novel uh, for Lamb. But as I was getting closer to, finishing it, I realized I was not going to kind of make a deadline. I had hoped to maybe publish it within a year of Lamb. And so I was like, okay, well, to buy myself some time, basically, I decided to go ahead and also self-publish Waterspout. And so it's a standalone novel, just like Lamb was a standalone novel, but I've put them into what I call the pink sheep novels, like the gay black sheep who, never quite know, where they are and who their tribe is and are always kind of, feeling like they're on the outside. So it's between Lamb and Waterspout, it's more of a thematic connection, but there will be follow-ups to Lamb. There will be a second and a third book for that to make it, like a series. So,
That's great. Yeah, it's something that's really interesting to me is the daddy boy dynamic.
oh,
And that I would love to hear because it's a big part of the book. And
it is.
it's something that I'm not, as a queer girl, like I don't have a corollary to that. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, just tell us a little bit about how that plays out in the book and your particular interest in that dynamic and exploring it.
So yeah, so in the book, and so in the book, briefly, in Waterspout, the main character Jimmy, uh, he's an aspiring artist, fine artist, painting, and but he kind of everything kind of falls apart for him at one point while he's living in San Francisco. So, like his roommate moves out and he can't stay because he's not on the lease. He was just subletting. So his roommate moves out. He loses his place to live. He loses his job. He gets laid off from an art store where he was working, and in a gallery show that he was doing, they cut him out, and they were like, you're done. We're moving on, and so he basically has to, pick up and start from scratch, and he gets a job across the bay, across the San Francisco Bay, and moves over there to a new apartment and so that is, and we talked a little bit about this, he moves into this kind of eccentric woman's apartment building, and it's very, sort of animagical, very very Tales of the City, and he ends up getting involved with the handyman who lives in the building, a Latino man who doesn't speak much English, and the handyman's boy, his younger his younger lover. And so he gets involved with the both of them, and they become, sort of not maybe in the book officially a throuple, but for a while they're close, and they're having sex, and they're getting to know each other and developing feelings and so forth. And so that's kind of the setup for the novel at the beginning. And so my own experience, when my husband and I opened our relationship about, I think it was about 10, 12 years in, we just decided, as many gay couples do, that we were kind of interested in. At first, I don't think it was necessarily having other relationships per se, but and I hadn't even heard of, like a daddy boy relationship. A daddy, is usually, and it's usually an older man with a younger man. And the younger man might call the daddy daddy, might call him sir, any of those things. And and so I hadn't even heard about that, but my husband, actually decided that, he found a guy that wanted to be his boy, and he wanted to be a daddy, and so they just started that. And once that became something that I realized was a thing, I was like, hmm, that sounds really interesting. And I was
Sounds
approaching,
good.
yeah, yeah, and I think I was 40, I was 40-ish by then, and I was kind of hitting that sweet spot where, a lot of younger guys start, sort of out of the blue, like on the grid, on Grinder, on this or that, whatever, start calling you daddy, you know what I mean? And I was just like, oh, I like the sound of that. So I ended up also finding myself a boy. But not only did I find one, I found two. I'm still in touch with one of them. I mean, we really developed a bond. They were both collared, which means it's the little chain with the padlock that you see on some gay men, and that means that they have a sir or they have a daddy, somewhere, and that they've been collared. That means that they're, bound to that person. And I think some people probably, like the daddy keeps the key and you can never take it off. That wasn't my style. You know what I mean? I was like, you keep the key, just wear it when we're getting together, and I'm fine with that. So that went on for 6 years. I had these relationships, and I was very upfront with them that that my husband and I were going to be moving to Spain at some point, or to Europe, and we kind of narrowed it down to Spain eventually. But so they knew that there was sort of an expiration date, and but the love and the feelings that we had. I mean, I considered us, me, my husband, and these boys or whatever, polyamorous, for that period of time. And there were, really great things about it, and there were some difficult things about it, but it was, it was it was an important chapter in my life, I have to say, because for me especially, I just I felt, sexually fulfilled, um, in a way that I didn't realize I could be. I mean, growing up closeted, growing up repressed, growing up, fearful of sex, and it's a big theme in Lamb was, the specter of AIDS in the 1990s after I came out. We already knew. I mean, even when people my age, guys my age, already knew that you needed to wear condoms when you first had sex. So you missed a lot of the horror of AIDS and of the decimation of those generations of gay men, but you still were, just it was there. It was looming over you. You were always afraid of a condom break, or, a slip because, you were a little tipsy and, you didn't wear one time or whatever. And so it was, for a long, long time, it was a really difficult situation to be in. And so the level of freedom, of exhilaration, of fulfillment, that I had while I was, sort of in these relationships, and carrying on this sort of lifestyle or whatever, was really, it was important. I wouldn't trade it for anything. You know what I mean? I've now kind of moved on from that. I'm not really interested, I don't think, in just kind of pursuing something like that again. But like I said, I'm still in touch with one of them. We chat. Oh, yeah. Um, I won't say, but never mind.
Oh, mystery. It's really interesting to hear this, because I've always considered myself monogamous, and I feel like uh, there's something changing in my brain, and that
Oh,
I'm interested in, my partner and I are in conversation about that.
oh,
Yeah, so it's just interesting to hear, and you and I have never talked about that.
no.
And I wonder about, it's interesting that the family nomenclature, that there's the dad. Like, I wonder, like, what role does this have in gay culture, this particular, and there's a polyamorous aspect of it, but the generational thing feels significant and particular. And I wonder, I don't know if you can comment on that.
I've given this a lot of thought, in part because I've been trying to write an article about it and having such a difficult time because it's still, even after 7 years having, since moving here or whatever, it's still very present to me in terms of being a recent chapter of my life. And I don't feel like I've quite processed it entirely. Um, and so it's kind of hard, but there was a couple of aspects that I think. Um, so one aspect is that it's a it's a long-term relationship. Ideally, you know what I mean? At least in my case, I think it was ideally. I was really never very comfortable having anonymous sex for one, and also having, just really casual sex that, didn't have any kind of emotional connection. It just wasn't my thing. And so, around about the time that we were opening up our relationship in the first place, we was also the rise of Grinder, of Scruff, of Growler, of all of the, there's a million of them now, but at the time there was, three or four, different, what we call the grid, because it's like, a little grid, a little Brady Bunch of of faces and, headless torsos and so forth. So the grid was rising as we were, and it just didn't feel natural to me, not that it was unnatural, but it just didn't, it, it wasn't where my kind of heart was. And so I think the thing that really kind of touched me and made me think, that it could be was the fact, that it could be a viable thing was the fact that, especially like having the collar, for example. I mean, that is like, I don't want to say it's like a wedding ring, but it's a kind of commitment. And that was kind of important to me because also I felt like, you just never, I just never felt personally that I could really completely be myself and be completely um, feel completely comfortable, with someone that I didn't know relatively well. And um, I actually sort of suffer. I mean, I've have a number of undiagnosed, disorders, let's say, the chief among them being like an anxiety and social anxiety. And one of the things that manifests for me is that in company, in groups, and so forth, and this continues to this day, I kind of have something of that sort of dissociative experience. It's like my body and my mind kind of disconnect a little bit, and I become very self-conscious, and I, not that I'm not responsible for, but I'm not my best self, with people I don't know well, and so I just never felt like I could really be, me, in those kinds of situations. So that was one of the big appeals for me, was that, you have this, and it doesn't try and mimic, um, the kind of relationship that someone has with I don't want to say equal partner, but, someone where it's like a marriage, or it is a marriage. With the daddy boy thing, the daddy kind of sets the rules. there's negotiation, there's safe words, there's, all this other kind of stuff. But I mean, when one person is making the decisions, there is a certain amount of um, simplicity, let's say, and a certain amount of control, obviously, but it is hopefully consensual in the sense that some people just really like not to have to make decisions about certain things, and some people, really are aroused by having that control taken away from them, to a certain extent. And so, or completely, I mean, in the case of, like master-slave relationships, which, there's crossover, but I love the kind of the it, it's a unique thing because I mean I'm afraid that some people think the whole daddy boy thing is kind of like a you know a pedophilic sort of dynamic, and it's not, you know what I mean. It's like this person is not a child, obviously, you know what I mean. The boy is a man, and but I think the dynamic ultimately is sort of like, for at least for a daddy, it's kind of like a benevolent, sort of a caring, benevolent kind of force of authority, but also of intimacy. So yeah,
Well, and it's interesting when I read, I read in your book, and then as we talk about it, power and a playful relationship with power, it's sort of like we're taking the some of the things that are essential for us as humans in our family structures, and we're kind of queerifying it, right? It's like we're making it ours in
yeah,
this safe and playful and consensual way, which I think is like the best of who we are in our community. That's how I see
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things in, sexual intimacy that, break other rules, that touch on taboos that in real life would not be acceptable, but when you're in a consensual adult relationship, the ability to fantasize about things and to let those fantasies free rein, give them free rein rather than sort of in this fearful way, like what will people think? Well, it's only just the two of you, you know what I mean? And so as long as it's, as long as you're both, in the vibe and it's consensual or whatever, you can do a lot more than you might otherwise not, feel free to do, I suppose.
I'm just thinking now, my brain is in families, and I'm going back to Jimmy. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Jimmy and his relationship with his mom, because that factors into the story in an important way, including the flashbacks and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Jimmy is the main character, and Jimmy is so one reader uh called him slutty little twink. And I guess that's accurate on one level, but I think it was in part through the relationship that he has with his mother, which is mainly conducted in the book over the phone. Here's a young gay man who still calls his mommy, every week without fail. And they have these incredibly funny, but also, like fraught conversations where she's a battle axe, and he, you know, pokes her, also acquiesces, also, kind of goes along with it. And there's love there, you know, but it's definitely a difficult relationship, and yet it's also the only relationship he has. His father has died, and even when his father was alive, Jimmy's father was so Jimmy was adopted, as I was. And his father was actually quite a bit older than his mother and made it quite clear in the book that he only kind of just, only decided to adopt a child because Marlis, because his wife really, really wanted to have a child. And so, there is that part of Jimmy which uh, has never really gotten beyond the problem that his father never bonded with him. He was just, as he calls him at one point, Marlis's egg. And, and so there is that part. And I think that is also too part of a lot of those daddy boy relationships that especially, for the boy there is some kind of need, and who knows where it comes from, whether some have probably very loving fathers, others maybe not so much, but there is that need to have that older presence, that older sort of steering you know uh, hand that kind of is reassuring in a way that they maybe didn't get and that Jimmy didn't get in his childhood. And so there are quite a few flashbacks in the book to incidents in his childhood that were either partly his mother, partly his father, and the dynamic that they had, the people that they were, and how that kind of shaped Jimmy into becoming, this slutty little twink who, kind of is very popular because he's young, he's blonde, he's super cute, and he's a total bottom. So, and he's very active on the grid, and he, in the process of kind of pursuing these, sort of uh, relationships, these, peccadillos and so forth, he develops a little bit of a drinking problem, which I did too when I was his age and on through, a good part of my life. And so that was also, some of the inspiration of for the book. And yeah. So I think Marlis, his mother, I I kind of love her. I mean, she takes no prisoners, and she's just this kind of crazy, hilarious, sort of not quite a caricature, but close, and I would love to see this woman on film. It would just be it would be she'd be the anti-hero of the movie, of the book.
Does she resemble your mom at all?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I think that yeah, for sure. I mean, there are words that the character speaks that came right out of my mother's mouth, but she's even more over the top. I mean, my mom was pretty quiet and pretty, sort of um withdrawn. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but Maros is just like, she's in your face, basically.
Yeah, it's a great character. It's just a really great character.
Thank
Um,
you.
Another aspect of the novel that is interesting to me is this sort of upstairs downstairs dynamic that we had talked about a little bit, and the thing that I related it to was Downton Abbey. I'm a huge Downton Abbey fan, but it reminded me a little bit of that sort of dynamic. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in the book and you're interested in that, exploring that.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to preface it by saying that, so Jimmy is he's this young kid. He's broke, basically. I mean, he's got no money. He's got to borrow money from his mom, just to move into his new apartment. He's lost his job. He has no savings. He's like many of us were in our, in our early mid 20s or whatever, or even beyond. And so he moves into this attic apartment, basically, in this apartment building. And in the basement lives the daddy boy couple that he gets involved with. And Ramon, the daddy, is the handyman of the building, and the boy helps him out with that, and so they get involved, and it struck me how uh, as I was writing it, how it, just the sort of the cliched upstairs downstairs dynamic was, not completely inverted, because Jimmy is still, white, and he has all of that privilege, and you know that he brings with him from generations past, and some of his opportunities. I mean, even though he loses opportunities, before the story even starts, new opportunities present themselves almost immediately, in part because of, being white, in part because he's cute, people, you know, want to give things to attractive people, basically. And so it's this weird dynamic where, he's kind of, I wouldn't say that downstairs and upstairs are exactly reversed, but I did want to play on that tension between, someone who is, white but completely broke, and someone who is brown and, actually has a stable situation, but at what cost? That comes out more as the story goes on, and you find out things. I don't want to give things away, but you and a lot of it happens behind the scenes, because even though the story is focused on Jimmy, the question of Ramon and his boy Oscar living down in the basement, and is there's a lot going on that doesn't actually ever get said. And I will say that the kind of the denouement, the climax of the story overall, as fantastical as it kind of may seem, I don't know if fantastical is quite the word. It's quite shocking, but obviously I'm not going to give away. But actually happened in my extended family. So that was not in exactly the same way, obviously, but the basic, facts of it. And so I admit I used that. It was not in my nuclear family. It was like I said, an extended family. But it actually happened, and that's what I intentionally invoked. In finishing the book with that. And so there's that. And then there was also the question of, the upstairs downstairs things. There's the question of the prologue, which just went live today on Substack. The prologue starts in New York City, starts in this very swank apartment in New York, on the east side of uptown, and it's the guy Paul, who is, the socialite, and the journalist, who kind of sets up the whole story with Jimmy, saying that he can set him up with in the New York art scene, and make introductions for him so that he could possibly make a go of his career as a painter. And so there's that juxtaposition of, this guy is wealthy, he married into wealth, there's trust funds involved, and that's where the story starts in the prologue, is at this party, in this really swank apartment. And I kind of like I wanted to kind of pull back from that intentionally. You know what I mean? I from the start, I kind of, and that's part of the whole fantasy thing, writing fantasy, writing anything that's kind of like, it's spies, it's kings and queens, it's princes, it's wizards, and spies, and superheroes, and all that kind of stuff. It just I just really, in my fiction especially, I really do want to kind of focus more on real people and real life. You know what I mean? I think it's really important that we, escapism is fine, you know what I mean? And there's, everybody, wants it sometimes, but also I just don't think I'm disappointed that that's kind of like, it's always extraordinary events, you know what I mean? And amazing adventures and that kind of thing. And I'm like, I really want to show, real life, real things that happen to real people and show how, that can be uh, just as amazing, just as important as, all of these things which are kind of mostly made up, you know what I mean? Are not realistic, you know what I mean? How do you learn? Escapism, great, but also can we learn something? You know what I mean? Can we see ourselves actually in some of these characters that we're reading about? So that's kind of what I have tried to focus on, not only in Lamb, in Waterspout as well. Um, and so, and in the next, sort of two books I've planned for the follow-ups to Lamb, there will be, and it kind of follows a progression because in Lamb you have, like teenage years and 20s, and in Waterspout you have also the same kind of similar time period. In the follow-up to Lamb, it's going to be middle age. It's going to be the second main character in Lamb, D, and his life, as a 50-year-old man, 20 years after the events of Lamb. And then the last book is actually going to go backwards to the 3 years after Lamb disappears from the first book. And I really kind of see that as, in a strange kind of way, like a spiritual older age. Like he kind of becomes this kind of wise person in his own fashion, even though he's still, about 30 years old at the time. But it kind of mimics, sort of the experience of putting all of the concerns, the kids are out of the house, you're retired from work or whatever like that. And so, what becomes of you at that point? In a lot of, for example, in a lot of Buddhist societies, many people actually retire and become monks, in some Asian cultures or whatever. So I'm not going to go that far, and I'm not going to go too deeply into that, you know what I mean? But I see that as this sort of arc of whole life in these four books. So
And I think what's so great about that focus on ordinary people is that I feel like we're in this period of social political we're in a period of transformation in the species, and it
yeah,
it puts a focus on, it's like 97% of the billions of people. It's like it's relevant. Like we need stories about us. We need that. We need models. We need ideas. We need an influx of creativity around thinking about what is our place in the world. And your work does that. And I have a tremendous appreciation for that. I think it's as political as going to a protest.
I think it's an important thing too. I mean, what I see in the wider culture generally is people who are sort of are desperate to keep I'm not sure what to call it exactly, deep down, I think it's the patriarchy. But also I kind of see it as the ruling class, the elitism, and I see a lot of our culture focused on the possibility that the average Joe, the average person, the average Joanna or whatever, can become that. Not that they should be happy in their own life and find the beauty and the meaning in their own life, but that they could always become that. You too can become super rich. The American dream is no longer just, a nice family and a nice house type of thing. It is, at the top, it is super rich. It is yachts and influencers and, everybody telling you that, it is a competition, and you need to scratch and claw your way to the top of that. And I just think it's damaging us.
Yeah, this is an alternative vision, and
Yeah.
that's what we need. So
Yeah.
I'm extremely grateful. I'm grateful in a million ways, but I'm particularly grateful because I do think about politics quite a lot,
Yeah.
yeah. So t just tell us a little bit about the launch and what you have planned, and um, yeah.
I've got a bunch of podcasts coming. So yeah. So besides visiting with you, I've got some other ones planned, and I've um, I've got the book arriving on the 14th. It's available for pre-orders. Um, and if I'm being honest, I've decided I was getting very burnt out at the beginning of the year as I was kind of finishing putting the final touches on Waterspout and starting. I had help last year. Uh, and this year I'm doing it all on my own. And so, and I put these spreadsheets together and I got to call this person, I got that person, and I got to send an email and I got to pitch, you know what I mean? And I started doing that. I did a little bit of that. And all of a sudden I was just like, I think I'm gonna, I'm gonna shrivel up and blow away if I keep this up. So I've been a lot more strategic about this time, and I'm kind of trying to just make the contacts that I've made um, sort of as meaningful and authentic as possible. And I know that the next book and the next book and the next book will just be, I'll be in a different place at a different time, and with different energy, I think. So this year, I think I'm a little bit of a low ebb, but next year, hopefully, maybe, I'll be at a little bit higher ebb. And it's always funny. Last year, I mean, sort of a few opportunities kind of just jumped out completely unexpectedly. You know what I mean? So you can always kind of hope for and believe that, maybe, something you've done and in, other spheres, with the newsletters, the writing, either this or that, you know what I mean? That people will kind of reach out to you and just be like, hey, how about this? Let's do this. You know what I mean? And yeah, so yeah.
I just have one question, which is always my last question. If you had some advice, because my readers and viewers and subscribers are mostly writers, what would your advice be to writers, particularly writers who are just starting out?
What would my advice be? Gosh, I mean, I would have given a completely different answer, a year ago. I'll probably give a completely different one next year. But the thing that I kind of that I'm on this year is, really listen to yourself and trust yourself. You are enough. It is enough. You don't have to, you don't have to hit it out of the ballpark, every single time, because you're not going to, number one. Number two, that kind of pressure, it accumulates, I really do think that, putting that kind of pressure on ourselves really, really, sort of leaves a deposit, and you can end up getting caked up with, just all of these things, all of these to-do lists, all of these spreadsheets and everything like that. You know what I mean? At some point, you just have to say to yourself, I'll do what I can. I'll do my very best, and that, is what I'm sending out into the universe, and the universe will have a response, will have a reply. And that will be where I land, and that will be enough, So I think, yeah, trust yourself, do your best, and let the rest go.
That's great. Mr. Troy Ford. It's been a total pleasure. Waterspout, and just give us the launch date again and show us the book again.
July 14th.
And we can order it where?
Gosh, it's currently the ebook's only going to be on Amazon for 90 days or so, but you can get the paperback. You can pre-order the paperback or just buy the paperback, whatever, from most major retailers, Barnes& and Noble, Amazon, obviously, and yeah, and it will be, I have a wide distribution, so you could order it at your local bookstore if you really wanted to.
Yes, and I
So,
encourage everyone to order everything through your local bookstores.
absolutely, absolutely.
Best of luck and thank you so much again.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.